As we get to the end of our lessons talking about registered title, I want to talk about the concept of priority because it's going to crop up quite a lot in future lessons' time. And so what we'll do is we'll talk about priority in this lesson, and then in the final two lessons we'll talk about one of the more complicated issues when it comes to registered title and registered title conveyancing, which is this idea of interests which override a registrable disposition, overriding interests which do not exist on the land register. We'll talk about the process in which this is actually operationalized, essentially. So, like I said, this lesson is going to talk about the general rules for priority when it comes to protected interests in the registered title system. Now, for those of you who want a specific citation, we will get to looking at this specifically in this lesson. But the concept of priority and the concept of registered interests in conveyancing is essentially an examination of sections 28 and 29 of the 2002 Land Registration Act. So we've talked about priority before, and it's something that is quite difficult for some, well, at least some newer law students to really get their heads around, because really what the idea of priority is essentially an idea of a bit like a queue of interests which exist. Okay, some interests take priority over other interests, simple as that. Now, where this happens, where one interest takes priority over another interest, the interests which take priority are the ones that will be binding onto others. And so when you talk about the process of land, like land exists for a very long time. So we have a registered estate. Let's say we have a registered estate that has existed for 50 years. And throughout the process of this 50 years, there have been multiple different instances where there have been new interests registered, where there have been conveyancings, where there have been new owners. And these are all dotted all across this timeline, okay? And the idea here is that the newer interests will be bound by the older interests. And so this is only circumvented if the newer interests can take priority. Now, we'll get to how this works in a second, but it gets interesting when we talk about which interests take priority in the course of a registered disposition, in the course of, for example, a conveyance, where a new purchaser comes and transfers title over. If a new purchaser takes ownership of title, which of the interests will they be bound to? I.e., which of the interests will take priority? Are there interests that exist before the conveyance that will have to be adhered to by the new purchaser? Well, if it is simply a temporal list, if it is simply temporal, that essentially every single interest that came before the new conveyance will bind them, then every single interest which came before the registered disposition will take priority. But it isn't, okay? And this is really where we get to sections 28 and 29 of the Land Registration Act. Section 28 says the following. It says that, except as provided by sections 29 and 30, the priority of an interest affected a registered estate or charge is not affecting a registered estate or charge is not affected by a disposition of the estate or charge. It makes no difference for the purposes of this section whether the interest or disposition is registered. So it looks here like where there is a disposition which takes place, the basic idea of priority is unchanged. So where a disposition takes place, where a conveyancing takes place, the interest affecting a registered a registered estate or charge is not affected by the disposition on that estate or charge, and it makes no difference whether or not this is registered or not. So it seems like priority is pretty straightforward in this regard. However, as you probably see the switcheroo in the legislation, it says here, except as provided by sections 29 and 30. Well, let's go to sections 29 and 30, mainly 29. We'll spend most of our time looking at 29 because that's where there are exceptions to this ordinary rule of priority. The ordinary rule of priority is this temporal nature of priority, where anything that is before, that comes before the conveyance will bind the new purchaser. But if we then go to the exceptions, we'll then see how this is changed, and how essentially a conveyance will jump the queue and will get priority over those previous interests. Okay, so section 29 says the following. It says that if a registrable disposition of a registered estate is made for valuable consideration, completion of the disposition by registration has the effect of postponing to the interest under the disposition any interest affecting the estate immediately before the disposition, whose priority is not protected at the time of registration. We'll get to what all of this means in a second. For the purposes of subsection 1, the priority of an interest is protected in any case if the interest is a registered charge or subject of a notice in the register, falls within any of the paragraphs of Schedule 3, appears from the register to be accepted from the effect of registration, and in the case of a disposition of a leasehold estate, if the burden of the interest is incident to the estate, okay, and then etc. 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 What does this all mean? Well, subsection 1 is the most important part of this particular piece of legislation. What it tells us here is that the general rule that we saw in section 28, which was the rule of priority, okay, and it states that there is not an effect on priority during a registrable disposition. Okay, this means that the list of interests are unchanged when there is a registrable disposition, like a conveyancing, for example. Okay, and so when that happens, there is no change whatsoever. They'll be bound to those interests, except for situations which fall under the exceptions in section 29. Section 29 and Section 30, but we're focusing on mainly Section 29. Section 29 simply says that the basic rule of priority, which we saw in Section 28, will not apply where a registrable disposition is made for valuable consideration, i.e. in exchange for some kind of consideration, like you would see, for example, in the law of contracts, something for something else, i.e. mainly the purchase of an estate, okay, and completed through a process of registration. This means that a purchaser will not be bound by the third-party interests, which would have been bound under Section 28, unless a notice has been entered, a restriction has been entered, or the interest has been upgraded to something known as an overriding interest, which we will see in Schedule 3 of the Land Registration Act. Let's go back to Section 29 then. So subsection 1 tells us all of this. Okay, it says that a registrable disposition, okay, so for example a conveyance, of a registered estate is made for valuable consideration, i.e. some kind of monetary value. Completion, if this is the case, and then completion of the disposition by registration has the effect of postponing the interest under the disposition, any interest affecting the estate immediately before the disposition. Okay, so that's any of the third-party interests which exist over the estate. Okay, and it will do so if that priority is not protected. And the ways in which we protect that priority is either through the concept of a notice or a restriction, or the fact that we have the interest being upgraded to an overriding interest, which means we look at Schedule 3 of the Land Registration Act, which we'll get to in the next lesson. That's essentially how this whole thing operates. It's very convoluted and very confusing, but if you explain it and you break it down in this kind of way, maybe reread Section 29 a couple of times to get a better understanding of how it works, that's how the Land Registration Act simply gives priority to the registrable disposition unless there has been a protection of priority. And a protection of priority is done through a notice, a restriction, or mainly a notice, or through Schedule 3, which we will get to in the next lesson.